Maximilien Robespierre, one of the architects of the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, was a man who once held immense power. He encouraged the execution of over 17,000 people who were regarded as enemies of the revolution, sending many to their deaths by guillotine, including King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. But despite being a man who sent so many to their doom on this brutal device, Robespierre himself eventually met the same fate. His execution was celebrated in the very place where King Louis XVI was beheaded, the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Robespierre was born in Arras on May 6, 1758. He studied law and became a lawyer, but his ambitions went far beyond the courtroom. In 1789, he was elected as a representative of the commoners of Arras in the Estates General, a general assembly representing the three estates of the realm: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. At that time, France was growing increasingly dissatisfied with its monarchy. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette had attracted widespread criticism for their lavish lifestyle, while the commoners suffered under harsh economic conditions. Many people couldn't afford food and were starving, while the royalty indulged in extravagant banquets, jewelry, and luxury. The Third Estate, which represented the commoners and some of the lesser clergy, declared itself the National Assembly, effectively a new government for France. Robespierre quickly became a leading figure in this new assembly, advocating for the rights of the poor and calling for the monarchy to be overthrown. He was a radical voice, fiercely critical of the king and queen, and he became the leader of the Jacobins, a powerful political group that promoted revolutionary ideals and the abolition of the monarchy. Robespierre's influence continued to grow, especially in Paris, where he was popular among the common people. He encouraged uprisings in response to military defeats and food shortages, positioning himself as a champion of the revolution. In August 1792, he was elected as the first deputy for Paris to the National Convention, which would go on to declare France a republic and abolish the monarchy. The execution of King Louis XVI in January 1793 was a turning point. Following the king's death, a power struggle ensued within the National Convention between the radical Jacobins, led by Robespierre, and the more moderate Girondins. The Jacobins used the power of the angry mobs to arrest the Girondins and seize control of the government. The Committee of Public Safety, of which Robespierre was a key member, assumed control of France. Robespierre quickly became the most powerful figure on the committee. France was in chaos. There were threats of invasion from foreign powers angered by the execution of the king and queen, as well as widespread lawlessness and disorder within the country. In response, the Committee of Public Safety began to eliminate anyone suspected of being an enemy of the revolution. This period, known as the Reign of Terror, saw mass arrests and executions as the government sought to maintain control through fear. Robespierre was a central figure in the Reign of Terror. He justified the extreme measures in a famous speech, stating, "If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without terror is baneful. Terror without virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, inflexible justice. It is an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the homeland." Under Robespierre's leadership, the revolution became a dark and violent period. Radicals controlled the government, and anyone suspected of disloyalty was at risk of arrest and execution. People lived in constant fear, knowing that even a slight criticism of the revolution could lead to their downfall. The guillotine was used mercilessly, and thousands of people, many of them innocent, were put to death. Even trivial actions, like cutting down a liberty tree, a symbol of the revolution, could result in execution. Women who wept as their husbands were executed were often dragged to the guillotine themselves, their tears seen as a form of defiance. Blood flowed in the streets, and heads rolled at an alarming rate. France was ruled by terror, and Robespierre was at the heart of it all. However, as his power grew, his popularity began to wane. Robespierre's downfall began when he pushed for the National Convention to proclaim a new official religion for France, the cult of the Supreme Being. This move, combined with the increasing brutality of the Reign of Terror, made him a symbol of tyranny. Many began to see him as no different from the monarchs he had helped overthrow. Ironically, French military successes at the time undermined the justification for the Reign of Terror, as the immediate threat to the country diminished. On July 27, 1794, a group of rebels within the National Convention conspired against Robespierre. He and his closest allies were arrested in what became known as the Thermidorian reaction. During the struggle, Robespierre was wounded, a bullet shattering his jaw. The circumstances of this injury remain unclear. Whether he attempted to take his own life or was shot by a soldier is still debated. Nonetheless, the wound left him unable to speak, a cruel twist for a man whose power had largely come from his ability to orate. The next day, July 28, 1794, Robespierre and 21 of his supporters were condemned to death without trial. The procession to the guillotine was long and humiliating. Robespierre, in excruciating pain from his jaw injury, was paraded through the streets of Paris. The same people who had once cheered for him now jeered and mocked him. The crowd had turned against him, seeing him not as a revolutionary hero, but as a tyrant who had betrayed the ideals of the revolution. One eyewitness described the scene. At 4 in the afternoon, the sinister procession moved out of the courtyard of the Palais de Justice. No crowd of such size had ever been seen in Paris. The streets were choked with people. Spectators, men and women of all ages, filled every window, and men had climbed onto the rooftops. There was universal jubilation, coupled with popular fury. The long-suppressed hatred against these criminals now exploded with double force. Everyone applauded wildly and seemed to be sorry they could do no more. The crowd's anger was directed squarely at Robespierre. His face was wrapped in a bandage of dirty, blood-stained linen, and his features were horribly disfigured. He kept his eyes downcast, possibly from the pain or perhaps from a sense of shame for the deeds he had committed. As the cart carrying him approached the guillotine, a woman forced her way through the crowd and shouted at him, "Monster spewed from hell, the force of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." Robespierre opened his eyes briefly to look at her, only to hear her say, "Go now, evildoer. Go down in your grave carrying the curses of the wives and mothers of France." When the cart reached the foot of the scaffold, the executioners carried Robespierre down. He was laid prone until it was his turn to be executed. While his allies were being beheaded, Robespierre appeared detached, keeping his eyes shut as if trying to block out the reality of what was happening. But when he was finally carried up to the scaffold, the executioner roughly tore away the bandage and splint that had been placed on his wounds, causing his jaw to unhinge and blood to pour from his mouth. His head, once the source of so much power and terror, was now a horrific sight. The blade fell, and Robespierre's head was severed from his body. When the executioner held it up by the hair to show the crowd, it presented a ghastly image of suffering and death. The man who had once commanded the fate of so many others had met a brutal and bloody end. In the days that followed, 83 of Robespierre's supporters were also executed, including many members of the Committee of Public Safety. The Reign of Terror, which Robespierre had helped to create and sustain, finally came to an end with his death.